see it, but there's going to be a bunch of stuff on the board, and if I don't write sort of small, we don't have enough boards. So my counsel is, if you've got some kind of smartphone, take a picture, preferably before I erase it, because I will erase it at some point in time. In Daniel 11, in the first couple verses, we have the justification for identifying the three Persian kings, and the fourth being far richer than they all are, as the last four presidents of the United States, which is Clinton, Bush the second, Obama, and Trump. Trump being far richer than they all are. And we have a second witness in Daniel 11 with the four Roman rulers, Pompey, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and Tiberius. And Daniel 11 is so profound that there are many symbols that these particular leaders represent in Daniel 11. They don't simply represent the last four presidents of the United States. The last president being the 45th, which is a symbolic number of this particular history. But we will deal with this some more, Lord willing, today. So I wanted to put that in the record. Where we went last night was in Daniel 11, verses 4 and 5. We have the breakup of Alexander the Great's kingdom into northeast, south, and west. And we identified that Seleucus, a general of Ptolemy being the king of the south, Seleucus begins to conquer the rest of the world. He conquers the east and the west and the north. By the time he's conquered the north, he has conquered three geographical obstacles, which makes him the king of the north. He's consolidated his kingdom. There's no more discussion about the kings of the east or the west from this point on in Daniel 11. It's just about the king of the north and the king of the south. And we're saying that this threefold conquering typifies the three horns that get removed to put the papacy on the throne of the earth in 538. So we're saying that verses 4 and 5 of Daniel 11 take you to 538. And then verses 6 through 9 talks about the history of, because the king of the north now has 3/4 of the kingdom, the king of the south is feeling threatened. So after 281, in 252, he sends his sister, I think it's his sister. Yeah.
It's his daughter.
Daughter. Okay, to marry the king of the north. The king of the north has to set aside his wife in order to make this happen, which he does. But ultimately, the first wife retaliates against Bernice. And this enrages the king of the south, so he comes to the king of the north's territory, comes all the way into the castle, takes the king of the north captive, and takes him back to Egypt. One of the keys in those verses 6 through 9, is that the king of the south here enters into the fortress of the king of the north, whereas later on, the king is just going to come up to the fortress. That distinction is very important historically. But this here equates to 35 years, and if you turn it prophetically into 3.5 years, we're saying that it's typifying the 1260 years, which is 3.5 prophetic years. And it's marking 538 from here, from verse 5, 538. And we noted the peace treaty in 1797 that Napoleon entered into with the papacy, that has been typified by the peace treaty of Bernice being given to the king of the north. And we noted the characteristics of the conquering here in 246 that we're saying is typifying the conquering in 1798, is that the king of the south, and this of course now we're getting into Daniel 11 verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. This is the pushing right here. This king of the south goes all the way into the fortress of the king of the north unmolested, takes the king of the north captive, takes him back to Egypt where he dies. He dies falling off a horse. He brings the treasures that had come with the dowry that had been sent to the king of the north for the marriage of Bernice to the king of the north was carried into the northern kingdom. So when the southern kingdom comes and retaliates for her execution, he brings these idols back into Egypt returns them to the temple of Bacchus, and he becomes known as the benefactor of the temple, because in 1798 we have the work beginning to restore the temple in heaven. Okay, that's what's being typified there. 1798, just as this northern king was taken captive and thereafter died in exile, the Pope is taken captive, thereafter dies in exile. And if you weren't aware of it, when Berthier captured the Pope, he walked right into the Vatican, right up to the Pope, and took him captive without any resistance whatsoever. That's what was typified in this history. So what we're saying is that the initial verses of Daniel 11 are illustrating the understanding of Daniel 11, 40 to 45 that came into history in 1989 and thereafter. And then the most important verse so far, I would say, is verse 10. And verse 10 is speaking about 1989. We have more to say about verse 10. We have more to say about all these things. We put some of them in place last night just so we'd have a point of reference today. But verse 10 is identifying the place where the Lord put his hand over the original understanding of this message. We're arguing that the Lord held his hand over this understanding here on the 1843 chart, the fullness of year mistake, until he removed his hand, and that the first seal that was opened in 1798 for the Millerites was the judgment hour cry, for the hour of his judgment has come. But Miller was incorrect on predicting 1843. And at the end of the Millerite history, Samuel Snow, after the hand is removed, he recognizes something that was not initially recognized by Miller. That's the fullness of the year mistake. So not only can he now calculate 1844, he can calculate October 22nd, 1844, and that is the midnight cry message. And it reaches its climax when the door closes on October 22nd, 1844. So I'm arguing that verse 10 here is the same thing in our history. What verse 10 tells us is that what we taught about Daniel 11, 40 to 45 initially was that in 1989, the Soviet Union, the king of the South, was swept away, but we did not recognize that the king of the South was Russia, and Russia remained. Last night, we went to an argument to try to uphold that. I want to go there again so you get my point. Go to Daniel 11:10. And as we go through this, if you follow my logic, you probably note that my logic is based upon understandings that have been established in this message and in this movement that by and large much of Adventism does not acknowledge. But in Daniel 11:10, it says, "But his sons shall be stirred up." This is the sons of the king of the north. They're going to retaliate against the king of the south. That's this history here, 1989, and it was fulfilled in 219 BC, historically. "But his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come." So he has two sons in this history. In your notes, it'll tell you their names. One of them is Seleucus Cyrannus, and the other one that is going to come is Antiochus the Great. He's the certain one. "And one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress." That word "even" is supplied, so he'll be stirred up to his fortress. And we're saying that he does not enter into the fortress. If you go back to verse 7, in the middle of verse 7, it says, "shall enter into his fortress." This is a distinction. Here, he only comes up to the border of his fortress. Now, in Daniel 11, verse 40, if you keep your finger in verse 10, this is, of course, the same chapter, but the very last phrase, a couple phrases of Daniel 11, verse 40 says, "And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." This overflow and pass over is the identical Hebrew words that are translated in verse 10 as overflow and pass through. Okay? But both of these verses are describing a conquering of the king of the south by the king of the north. Okay, that's something that these two verses have in common. And they have this expression, overflow and pass over. But verse 40 doesn't make any distinction. It just says the countries. Okay, there's no distinction about whether he comes up to the border or he goes into the fortress. But verse 10 says he comes up to the border of Egypt. He doesn't go all, and history attests to the fact that he only comes up to the border of Egypt. So last night I took you to one other place, and this is where I'm saying that this is kind of a truth that's exclusive to this message more than Adventism. If you go to Isaiah chapter 7, in Isaiah chapter 7 we know we have the starting point for the 2520, and most of Adventism would reject all of this, although when we first started teaching Isaiah 7 in connection with the 2520, I'm pretty sure I was the first one that taught it, and I got it from Hiram Edson. It's not like it was any, new light. I read an article by Hiram Edson. It's old pioneer understanding. But if you go to chapter 7, where you'll see this time prophecy set forth, and it is in verse, pardon me?
Verse 8?
Verse 8? No. We're going to go to Isaiah. Last night we went to Isaiah 8:8, but I want to show you something else here in this time prophecy that is in verse. Where is it? Within 6. It is 8?
Within 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, there it is. Okay. Verse 8 is cut in half on my page, so I wasn't saying. Isaiah 7, verse 8 says this. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. Now we understand that this 65 years prophecy is given in the year 742 BC. And it says within 65 years, the northern kingdom is going to be carried into captivity, and 19 years later, the northern kingdom's carried away captive in 723 BC. And then at the end of that 65 years, you're at 677, and that's where the southern kingdom's carried into captivity. And we know that this 19 and 46 plays out in the history of the Millerites as well. It's a chiasm. But what I want you to see here is in these two verses, it's making a point of saying that in verse 8, the head of Syria is Damascus. What is Syria? It's a country. What is Damascus? It's the capital. Okay, so it's emphasizing this, and it even says that the head of Damascus, the capital city, is Rezin. Who's Rezin? He's the king. And that's like Daniel 2, where Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, thou, O king, are the head of gold. The king is Babylon. But in these two verses, verses 8 and 9, where we find this prophecy, for some reason it's letting us know that in verse 9, the head of Ephraim is Samaria. What's Ephraim? It's the northern kingdom. What's Samaria? It's the capital of the northern kingdom. This is Virginia? What's the capital of Virginia? Richmond. Okay, so it's making this distinction in this passage. So when you get to Isaiah 8, verse 8, and this is the same prophecy, and please don't miss that it's 8:8, but we won't deal with that. It says in this prophecy against Ahaz, Ahaz is a wicked king of the south. Ahaz is the king of Judah. He's the king of the south, and he's wicked. And his wickedness is manifested in desecrating the temple. You need to keep that in mind, because the southern kings also desecrate the temple in Daniel 11. So this is a characteristic that ties in with Daniel 11. So in this pronouncement against this southern king, let's start in verse 5 again. The Lord spake also unto me again, saying, forasmuch as this people, Ahaz's people, refuses the waters of Shiloah, and Shiloah is the Old Testament word for the New Testament word Siloam. Okay? So you can tie this into the latter rain message that Ahaz is rejecting at the end of the world, but he's rejected the waters of Siloam, the waters of Shiloah, that go softly and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, rejoicing in a confederacy. Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria. And so they reject the waters of Siloam, and they're going to get the waters of the Euphrates. They're going to get the king of the north as punishment. And this is about the king of the north punishing the king of the south. He says, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks, and he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. This is the same expression, the same Hebrew words that are found in Daniel 11:10 and Daniel 11:40, this overflow and Passover. He shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of the land, O Emmanuel. What that's saying is that he's going to conquer all of the territory of the king of the south. He's going to take all of Judah, but he's only going to come to the neck. What's above the neck? The head. And what's the head? It's the capital. Jerusalem was the capital. He captures everything but the capital. So Isaiah 8:8 is giving a second witness to when the king of the north comes against the king of the south, it comes just to the borders of Egypt. We never saw that when we were dealing with Daniel 11:40. We thought the whole Soviet Union was swept away and therefore the king of the south was out of history. But now what we understand is that the king of the south is still there, alive and well in history. And the capital of the Soviet Union was Russia, or if you want to put it more distinct, Moscow or the Kremlin. Okay, and it's still standing as the king of the south. The Lord held his hand over this, and therefore the fact that we're now seeing it is paralleling the understanding that Samuel Snow began to get in December of 1843. That puts together the Midnight Cry message that only escalates and grows until the door closes. And for us, the door closes at midnight. So I want you to see that coming up to his neck, this is part of this prophecy, and that the head is the capital city, and the head was left in Daniel 11:10. And you have to see that. The reason you got to see that is this is where the Lord is removing his hand in our history. This is big stuff. Okay, now in verses 11 and 12, you're going to have the Battle of Raphia, which we're going to deal with. And 13 through 15, you're going to have the Battle of Peniam. The Battle of Peniam is the anchor to this whole thing. Once you get the Battle of Peniam straight in your mind, the lights that comes out of Daniel 11 is just overwhelming. Okay? But what I want to remind you of, I mentioned it last night, but we'll put it in the record one more time. We understood correctly that Daniel 11 verse 40 begins in 1798, and it goes until the Sunday Law. The Sunday Law is verse 41 of Daniel 11. He shall also enter into the glorious land. Okay? So from 1798 to the Sunday Law, this is the history of verse 40. And we knew there was things, I mean, I've known there was things that were in the history of verse 40 after 1989. But when we thought about Daniel 11 verse 40, we understood that in 1989 the Soviet Union swept away, the king of the south swept away. So we really didn't see any other details between 1989 and the Sunday Law in verse 40. Okay? We knew that 9/11 is in this history. We knew that. But in terms of actual Daniel 11 having anything to say about it, we didn't see it. But what we're understanding now is that Daniel chapter 11, that Jesus illustrates the end of Daniel chapter 11 with the beginning of chapter 11. And it's in the beginning of chapter 11 where he's showing us that before the Sunday Law, and I'm going to show you where the Sunday Law is in these beginning verses, that there are two other waymarks. And if you've been studying this message, you know that when you see something doubled, it's the midnight cry. Or it can be midnight, the midnight cry, if you have a doubling. And this is a battle, and this is a battle. Battle, battle. Raphia, Paneum, which gives you it's the first argument that you can put this as midnight, and this is the midnight cry. Because if you see that from 1989 until the Sunday law, that there's two waymarks that are being revealed, you could argue, well, maybe one of them is 9/11. And so I'm arguing that no, it isn't 9/11, that the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Paneum is midnight and the midnight cry. And my first argument is that there are two battles. Battle, battle. Okay, you got the doubling there. But in order to put this in place, I need to show you the Sunday law. So if you would, go to verse 13. This will take a second. Daniel 11, verse 13. What we're saying here, brothers and sisters, is that the king of the south in these verses is Russia. And that in 1989, the king of the north swept away the king of the south. We didn't realize that Russia was still standing. But the king of the north in 1989 was an alliance between the papacy. Pardon me? Did I say something wrong? No. No? What are you saying?
You said alliance between Rome and
The United States. Yeah, the secret alliance that took place between the United States and the Vatican that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 is there in verse 40. The chariots represents economic strength. The horsemen and the chariots and horsemen represent military strength, and the ships represent economic strength. In verse 40, they come together with the papacy to sweep away the Soviet Union. But this is about the princes. Okay, this is about the military struggles. Daniel 11 is about the rise and fall of kingdoms. So the United States comes together with the papacy before 1989, and from this point on, the papal army in history is the United States. So we're relating to these verses that the United States is the king of the north. It's the representative of the king of the north in these verses. Okay, so in verse 10, when you have 1989 typified, then the two powers that you're talking about is Russia and the United States. Okay, so when you get to verse 13, and I'm not dealing with verse 13 at this point. I'm going to give you just a brief overview. We'll go back into verse 13. Verse 13 is the Battle of Paneum. It is the anchor for all of this. But I just want you to see the structure here. In verse 13, it says, "For the king of the north shall return." So who's the king of the north? The United States. Okay. "And shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years." Note the certain years is being mentioned there. "With a great army and with much riches." This is talking about when the United States is going to be defeated in the near future by Russia, and then the United States is going to retaliate against Russia. And verse 13 is the United States retaliating against Russia. Okay, and verse 14 really doesn't say much about this war. It's really verse 13 and 15. So I'm going to skip over verse 14. It says in verse 15, "So the king of the north, the United States, shall come and cast up a mound and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south," Russia, "shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand." This is the end of Russia. This is the end of the king of the south. Okay, so the end needs to be marked. Now we know the end needs to be marked for a number of reasons, but one of them, we know exactly when the king of the south came into history now. Never thought much about it before, but now the French Revolution identifies that when King Louis XVI's head was chopped off in 1793, that king of the south arrived in history. Okay, and Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning, so there comes a point where the king of the south is going to come to its end, and you can show it by 1793. And I'm saying this is the point here from another level. This is where Russia comes to its end. But what I want you to see is this chart over here. This is the only date on these charts that really doesn't have any biblical reference to it. Okay? It says 164, death of Antiochus Epiphanes, who of course stood not up against the prince of princes, as he had been 164 years dead before the Prince of Princes was born. The controversy, the primary controversy in the Millerite history was who was the king of the north. The Protestants are identifying the king of the north either two ways. The Protestants argued the king of the north. The minority argued that it was Islam. Okay? And some of them argued that it was the last of these Syrian kings. Okay? But the Millerites knew that the king of the north was pagan Rome. Okay, go to verse 14 now. Verse 14. This is Miller uses verse 14 to counter the Protestant teaching that Antiochus Epiphanes is a subject of prophecy. This controversy was so significant in the Millerite history that it makes its way on that chart, which we're told was directed by the hand of the Lord and should not be altered. Okay, but there really is no biblical reference for 164 or Antiochus Epiphanes. You know, he's in these stories, but that's more about the controversy. So I want you to understand that when William Miller is addressing this controversy, he uses Daniel 11:14, and he says this. And in those times, now in verse 13, I pointed out, after certain years. Okay, there is a period of time where the United States is going to have been defeated by Russia. It's going to enter into a peace treaty with Russia. Right there at the Battle of Raphia, almost before it's over, there's going to be a peace treaty. But then the United States is going to begin to consolidate its army and its money, and it's going to start building an army for this upcoming battle in Pippenger. And I'm saying that because these verses teach that directly on more than one witness. Okay? So this certain years is the time period when the United States is rebuilding its army to finally take Russia out. And it says in verse 14, in those times, in between the battle of Raphia and Pippenger, in this time here, shall many stand up against the king of the south. Trump is going to be bringing the nations of the world into a confederacy with him to deal with Russia. Shall many stand up against Russia? Okay, they're standing up because they're going to take on Russia. And then it says, also the robbers of thy people. And here's where William Miller argued in his history that this has to be a different player. Okay, you have the king of the north getting ready to go against the king of the south, and William Miller, he focused on one word, and that word was also. You know, when he was writing out his article, he wrote also in capital letters. Also, the robbers of thy people, because it's making a distinction. Here is a different entity that is not the king of the north or the king of the south or those people that are standing up against the king of the south. Here's a new player introduced, and this is pioneer understanding. This is when pagan Rome is coming into history. Okay, it says, also the robbers of thy people, and this Hebrew word that's translated as robbers is more often than not translated as breakers. It's the breakers of thy people. Of course, this means a lot if you understand that Rome is the one that stamps and breaks God's people. They're the breakers of God's people. Okay? They shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So, the subject that establishes the vision is Rome. This was the argument of the Millerites. You got to see Rome here. You can't see these Syrian kings. You can't see Islam. What establishes the vision is Rome. That's why Sister White has a statement where she says, the last scenes clearly revealed. The workings of the man of sin are the last features plainly revealed in the Word of God, something like that. Because Rome is what establishes the vision. So in the Millerite history, now what I'm saying is this is such a fundamental truth to the pioneers, that verse 14, the robbers of thy people, was pagan Rome. It makes it onto that chart. So this is foundational, and I want to tell you that because I'm about to tell you that it isn't pagan Rome. Okay, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to go give those old pioneer positions right now, so put your thinking caps on, please. All right. It says, so in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. In this history, back here between the Battle of Panium and the Battle of Panium in the history of 217 to 200. Okay, this would be 217 BC, 200 BC. Pagan Rome comes into history. It exalts itself. It's the one that's going to fall. But this history here is typifying our history. And what it's saying is in between the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Panium, Papal Rome comes into history. Pagan Rome is typifying Papal Rome in our history. The pagan Rome of that history is typifying Papal Rome at the end of the world. And now I want you to see this, okay? You can see this grammatically if you follow along, all right? Verse 15 now says this. So the king of the north, who's that? The United States shall come and cast up a mountain, take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand. Russia's not going to be able to resist this. Russia is going to be defeated. Neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Russia has some chosen people that get swept away too. All right?
Their allies?
Yes.
You said that last night, they find their allies.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that it's Islam, but I don't know that. I need a couple more witnesses for that. All right. What's happening in the world right now is Russia is allying itself with Islam, with Iran specifically. So this very well could be the chosen people. That's not my point. Okay, this verse 15 is talking about the United States defeating Russia. Okay, so now you got to look at verse 16. Verse 16 says, but he that cometh against him, who's the him? It'd be the United States. It's got to be grammatically. Now it's talking about a power that's going to come against the United States. But he that cometh against the United States shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Okay, this is the Sunday law in the United States. And who defeats the United States at the Sunday law? Papal Rome. Okay, Papal Rome has been introduced in verse 14. It's about ready to come against the United States. And when we first understood Daniel 11, 40 to 45, and the king of the north enters the glorious land in verse 41, the very first point of reference was verse 16 here, because this is the only other place that Daniel uses the expression glorious land. And we use this to identify that the glorious land in ancient times was typifying the glorious land at the end of the world.
It doesn't sound right because they have clasped hands with each other before that, right?
What do you
They're
mean?
in alliance.
Well, he's going to conquer the glorious land here in verse 41. But you already see him in those times. He's coming in here. He's already in union with them here. Okay, so this is the climax of him conquering the United States. The United States was overcome back here when they formed a secret alliance. You form an alliance with the devil, you're lost. Okay, they already fell. But this here, by his hand it's going to be consumed. In Daniel 11 verse 41, it says, and many shall be overthrown, but these shall escape his hand, even Edom, Moab, and Ammon. So those that escaped during the Sunday law, they escaped his hand. But here in verse 16, it's by his hand that the United States is consumed. So, what I'm saying is, verse 16, this is verse 41, but it's also verse 16.
So, I'm kind of torn here. 41 speaks of the overthrow of the glorious land, and Edom, Moab, and the chiefs of children of Ammon escaping. But then you go to 42, which talks about Egypt, which is the world. So isn't that the Sunday law? I mean, isn't really 42 where the world is there? Because the Sunday law points, are we talking about the global Sunday law there?
Okay, so just to make sure that your question's being put on the record, and I won't repeat your question, I'm not sure how to repeat it, but I'll try to answer it, is that we understand that when modern Rome takes control, the world has to overcome 3 geographical areas. The first was the King of the South, 1989. The second was the glorious land of the United States. And the third is Egypt, verses 42 and 43. When it conquers the United States, it's at the Sunday law in the United States. And thereafter, it's going to conquer Egypt, representing the rest of the world. And it's all the conquering that from the Sunday law onward, it's all the Sunday law crisis. So Sister White says, though the United States leads out, every country on the globe is going to follow her example. So now Egypt's being confronted with the same test. Okay? So now, tell me your question again.
So, okay, at midnight and midnight cry, I understood that there were Sunday laws for there in those periods as well, no?
Okay, now you're getting into the details of midnight to midnight cry, and there's definitely going to be a Sunday law at the midnight cry, and there's at least one typified here at midnight, but I don't know how directly midnight is a Sunday law, if it's just a typification, but definitely the first Sunday law marks the midnight cry. And your question is?
Well, I'm looking at verses. Verse 42 is where you...
Okay, now verse 42 is Egypt.
Egypt, exactly.
Third obstacle.
Right.
Okay, so let me show you something.
Okay.
Go to verse 17. He shall set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give her the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. This is Julius Caesar going into Egypt and conquering it in 47 BC. Okay, so this is the perfect sequence. It's first the glorious land, verse 16, and then Egypt, verse 17. All right, so it's the same structure. But what I want you to see here, once you have that down pat, is that in verse 40, you do not see the Battle of Raphia or the Battle of Panium. All you see is 1989, and then you see verse 41, the Sunday law. But once the Lord removes his hand from verse 10, and you realize that the king of the south was Russia, and it didn't get taken out in 1989, it was still sitting there, then these verses talk about these two battles, Raphia and Panium. And suddenly, things open up in a profound way.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Okay, so verse 40 speaks of countries being overflown.
Yes?
So it's no longer the Soviet Union. We're saying it's what, all of the satellites that fell, and
It's the countries that made up the Soviet Union. But in this history here, the king of the north, when he attacks in 219, the king of the south has a bunch of geography that it owns. The king of the north comes and takes it all, but he stops at the borders of Egypt, thus typifying that in 1989, the king of the south, Russia, has a bunch of countries that it owns, but they're going to get swept away, but only come to the borders of Russia, only up to the neck. The capital gets left. But we didn't see that. That's the sleeper that the Lord removes his hand from, and then we can see these two battles. You all following the logic here? Okay. All right. So now they told me we were going to go for an hour or an hour and 15 minute take a break. I didn't pay attention to when we stopped. Started. Or stop. So it's got to be up to you, my brother. You got to give me the direction. Another half hour. Okay, so the reason that I jumped beyond verses 11, 12, 13, and 15 is so that I could show you that verse 16 is the Sunday law. Okay, you have 1989 here, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the head is still there, the king of the south. You got the Sunday law. So now we'll go back into these verses and look at these two battles. Okay. In Daniel 11, in verse 11. Daniel 11, 11. There's a doubling there. 11, 11. And what does the number 11 represent? The closed door. Because you have 12 disciples come to the closed door at midnight, and Judas falls, leaving 11. Okay, so you've got a closed door here for the priest and a closed door here for the Levites. 11, 11. This is the history that it's talking about, unless you think that's a little bit fanatical. But if you do think that's a little bit fanatical, I'll even put a stumbling block, a greater stumbling block before you. This history here, if you look carefully, it's represented in Daniel 1:1, Daniel 2:2, Daniel 3:3, 4:4, 5:5, 6:6, 7:7, 8:8, 9:9, 10:10, 11:11, and 12:12. Okay, and this is the history of 45. This is the history of 45. Okay, so go to Daniel 12:12, so you get my point about this being the history of 45. Blessed is he who waiteth and cometh to the 1,335 days. On this chart, this 1,335 days is what's used to establish 45. Okay? Because it's taking you to 1843. The end of 1843. Okay, so the verse says, blessed is he who waiteth and cometh. And this Hebrew word cometh means toucheth. Okay, so the blessing is to be involved with the midnight cry and move into the most holy place with Christ on October 22nd, 1844. But the people that do that, they will have touched 1843. You're going to get a blessing if you're living in 1844. But in order to get that blessing, you have to touch 1843. And where do you touch 1843? On the very last day of 1843, touches the very first day of 1844. So you're talking about the first disappointment. It's saying, blessed is he who waiteth and cometh to April 19th, 1844. And the symbol of that is the number 45. And it's found in Daniel 12:12. And what does 12 times 12 represent? It's about the 144,000. Every doubling in the book of Daniel is talking about this history here. And it's the history of 45. So when we're looking at Daniel 11:11, it says, and the king of the south. And I need to get to my notes, so I make sure I don't have these all memorized yet. These names beat me up. The Battle of Raphia.
What page?
I'm on page 6 of the notes, under Daniel 11:11 and 12. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth and he, this he there, is the king of the north. And he, the king of the north, shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the king of the south's hand. Okay, the king of the south is Russia. Russia is going to be moved with choler. The United States is going to build a mighty army. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to start building up the military complex here in the United States? He's already doing it, okay? The United States is going to build up a mighty army, but the king of the south is going to be moved with choler, and is going to come and attack him. And verse 12 says, and when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up. And this is one of the keys, his heart being lifted up. This is one of the things you need to see in these verses. And he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Russia is going to wipe out many 10,000s, but he's not going to be strengthened by it. Now, one of the things you can find in the actual Battle of Raphia is almost before the battle was over, Antiochus fled to another city where you would think he was going to make another stand, but instead of making another stand as Ptolemy is coming after him, he puts in place a peace treaty. Okay, so when you see that, you can assume that whatever this battle is that's going to take place between Russia and the United States, almost immediately there's going to be a peace treaty put in place. Okay, but all that is for both sides to begin building up even a more thorough army. Okay, but that's part of the story of the Battle of Raphia if you go into it. But the point is in that history, back here in 217 BC, no one thought the king of the south could defeat the king of the north. He was the underdog across the board. He was the underdog. And in the world today, most people think Russia's the underdog, okay? But they have the element of surprise. But because of that, when the king of the south won in that history, the whole world was so astounded that they were suddenly forced to start praising the king of the south. You want to be on the right side of the issue. So even the Jews, they reached out to Ptolemy and said, come visit us in Jerusalem, okay? Because they wanted to get on the right side of the new power broker on planet Earth. And when he went to Jerusalem, he gets fascinated with the Jewish temple service, and he goes in there and he decides he wants to do an offering in the temple service. And the priests begin resisting him, and it creates havoc, and he gets irritated, and he goes back into Egypt and executes a bunch of Sabbath-keeping Jews in Egypt. He even makes the point of making a brand of the god of Bacchus and branding some of the Jews, mark of the beast, persecution. Okay, so all of this stuff is being typified here by this king of the south, and this typification is symbolically represented in the fact that his heart was lifted up. Okay, so we want to look at that. And if you go to Daniel 5:23, you know this story, so we will just point it out for you and move on. In verse 23, speaking of Belshazzar, it says, but has lifted up thyself against the Lord. This is the same action as the king of the south. In verse 12 of Daniel 11, his heart's lifted up, and we know that Belshazzar, when his heart was lifted up, he brings in the sacred vessels, and he's going to drink wine with them. Okay, so a king's heart being lifted up is representing them desecrating the temple in some way, some fashion. Okay, now this is a king of the south. And in that history, he accomplished a persecution upon the Jews. The mark was put in place. But there's also another king of the south that has the same experience. And so if you go to 2 Chronicles 26, and beginning in verse 16. And if you just drop back to verse 14, you can see which king it is. It says, and Uzziah prepared. Okay, Uzziah is a king of Judah. That makes him a king of the south. This is a story about Uzziah. And what I'm saying is Uzziah's heart's going to get lifted up. Here's a king of the south, King Uzziah. His heart's going to be lifted up just like Ptolemy's heart is lifted up, just like Belshazzar's heart was lifted up. In all three cases, you're going to see some temple desecration. Okay, so in verse 16 of 2 Chronicles 26, it says, but when he was strong, Uzziah, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. This is just what Ptolemy did. Okay. And Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him 80 priests of the Lord that were valiant men. How many priests would that be? No, it wouldn't. 80 is 80. Let's read it again. And Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him 80 priests. 81. Azariah is 1, and 80 is 80. There's 81 priests. And you can show that 81 is a characteristic of midnight, okay, on more than one witness. So you got 81 priests, which would lead you to put it at midnight. And they withstood Uzziah the king and said unto him, it appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests of the sons of Aaron that are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for thou hast trespassed. Neither shall it be for thine honor from the Lord God. Then Uzziah was wroth, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was wroth with the priests, the leprosy even rose up in his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord from beside incense altar. Now, Ptolemy, the king of the south, when he goes back into Egypt, he's going to put a mark of Bacchus on the Sabbath-keeping Jews in Egypt, and he's going to kill thousands of them. Okay, so you're seeing some parallels here. Verse 20. And you're seeing, by the way, you're seeing a contrast too here with Azariah and Uzziah, because they're the same name. They're the same name. You're seeing a wicked and a righteous person, a priest and a king, but it's the same name that is expressed differently. Verse 20, and Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked upon him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they thrust him out from thence. Yea, himself hasted also to go out, because the Lord had smitten him. And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord. And Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. So what I'm saying here is, in this history here, Ptolemy, his heart's lifted up. He attempts to desecrate the temple. There's persecution that begins. And typically when we mark the abomination of desolation as a sign, we have to understand the abomination of desolation sign, right? Because Sister White quotes Matthew 24:15, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, let him who is in Judea flee, so on and so forth. And Sister White takes that two different places, and she says, so too for us will be the Sunday law, a sign that we are to leave the larger cities in advance of going to the smaller cities, something along that line. She's telling us that we have to understand what the abomination of desolation sign is, because it's a sign for us to flee, just as it was a sign for the Jewish Christians to leave Jerusalem. But typically when we see the abomination of desolation, we think it's got to be a king of the north that stands in the holy place. But here, in both of these temple desecrations, it's a king of the south. But it's a king standing in the holy place desecrating the temple, so it sounds pretty much like the sign of the abomination of desolations, except it's the southern king, not the northern king. But let me show you how that doesn't matter whether it's a southern king or a northern king. Go to Psalm 84, and I'm sure that Psalm 84 is where Jesus was referring to. I think it's 84. If it's not 84, it's 89. It's 89. Okay. I should have looked this up. Somebody got an or got a CD-ROM real quick, so we can. I'm spinning my wheels on this. I had it in my mind it was 84. Type in enemy and signs in Psalms. Restricted to Psalms. '79 perhaps? No. Okay, just type signs into Psalms.
Yeah, Psalm 74.
Psalm 74. Okay, there you go. Thank you. That sounds a little bit like 84. Okay, Psalm 74, this is it. And what I'm saying is this is Jesus' point of reference for Matthew 24 and the abomination of desolation. That's my claim. When you read it, you'll see it. Verse 1 says, O God, why hast thou cast us off forever? Why doth thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture? Remember thy congregation which thou hast purchased of old, the rod of thine inheritance which thou hast redeemed, this Mount Zion wherein thou hast dwelt. Lift up thy feet unto perpetual desolations, even all that the enemy hath done wickedly in the sanctuary. Thine enemies roar in the midst of thy congregation. They set up their ensigns for signs. Now, it goes on, but here in the sanctuary, the enemies set up their ensigns for signs. That's what pagan Rome did in AD 66. They sent the standards of the Roman authority in the sacred precincts of the temple that extended some furlongs outside of the city. You all know that story. That was a fulfillment of the abomination of desolation that Jesus had warned about. But here, there is no qualification that it has to be the king of the north. It's just an enemy. The enemy set up their ensigns for signs as they're desecrating the temple. So what I'm saying is,
Whether it's north or south today.
yeah, there's no qualification in here in the first point of reference that it has to be a southern king or a northern king. So what I'm saying here is this particular action of Russia becomes a characteristic of the sign that you and I have to see. Okay. And you know, in the time of Christ, the Jews were repeatedly saying to Christ, show us a sign. You know why they were asking Jesus the question, show us a sign? Because they didn't know what the sign was. They had to have the sign defined for them. They didn't know what it was. We need to know what the sign is in order to recognize it. Okay, so what I'm saying is, this Battle of Raphia back here in 217 that I'm arguing marks midnight, we're being instructed right now what that sign is. And that sign is what Russia's about to do in the United States. And if you're not... I have difficulty with your name, sister. Tell me your name.
Aliona.
Aliona, okay. If you're not familiar with the religious liberty laws that are going on in Russia over the past 6 months, you talk to this sister or Sister Alla. What's going on over there is just absolutely incredible. I know of people that won't call home to Russia and speak about religious things on the phone because they do not want to get their relatives in trouble. Okay, it's that restricted. So the implication here is that at this battle, there's immediately going to be a peace treaty, but Russia is going to implement some kind of unbelievably restrictive religious liberty law in Russia and any other country it has authority over, and it's going to lead Seventh-day Adventists in the United States. It's going to put them in such a fear about what's coming because the United States just lost the war that they're going to come into some kind of an agreement with the government of the United States as they begin to turn against those people that are the minority view of Adventism, which I'm hoping is us. So all of this story, what I'm saying without getting into the details, this story about what goes on in 217 with Ptolemy when he goes back and accomplishes this persecution, it's pointing to something that's going to go on when Russia takes down the United States. And it's a sign.
Is it going to be the persecution of Seventh-day Adventists within Russia? Is it kind of like a sign of the coming Sunday law, that it will be first?
Now, I don't know the details of it, but I think it's going to be some kind of religious persecution against Christians in general, which includes Seventh-day Adventists. But brothers and sisters, here at midnight, we've been studying midnight for quite some time. Jesus is our example in all things. And the Jews knew that they needed to get Jesus convicted of two things. Blasphemy, so the Hebrews would reject Jesus, and sedition and treason, so the Romans would reject Jesus. They had to have those two-prong arguments at midnight when they arrest Jesus. And what we're doing right here, right now, when it gets out on the internet, we're saying that Russia is about to defeat the United States in an unexpected war. And I guarantee when that crisis hits, this kind of language is going to be twisted to represent treason and sedition. Okay? And the Seventh-day Adventist Church is going to be so scared about what's going on because we're also identifying that they are being passed by as God's people. They're going to have motivations to go to the government and put some pressure on the government to do something with God's people here. There's a threefold union here. There's Judas, who is someone that has been in this movement, or a group that it's the foolish priests. They're going to come together with the Adventist Church and the government of the United States right here. And this story here, the Battle of Raphia, is telling us that part of what creates the circumstances for this to happen is what Russia does immediately after the Battle of Raphia in Russia. And I don't know more details than that, but I do believe that that's what this history is dealing with. And this history is an illustration of a sign. We have to know this in advance. Okay. By the way, in the history of Ptolemy, that in this victory, they were known as a ruthless, cruel, and immoral people. The Egyptians of that time period were. And if you know anything about the Russians and how they accomplish their warfare, that's exactly what they are. Okay? If you have a hostage situation here in the United States where I have a machine gun and I'm holding you all hostage, the Americans, they're going to get a sniper out there and they're going to take me out. The Russians are going to kick in the doors and windows with the guns blazing, and they're going to figure out who was on the right side of the issue afterwards. They might not even use guns. There was one time when they put in poisonous gas and killed a bunch of people in Russia. Okay, they're ruthless and immoral, and I'm not trying to get the Russians mad at me. I'm trying to show that the characteristics of the Egyptians in this history is typifying the characteristics of Russia in present day history. It's
She's Ukrainian. She's Ukrainian.
so I only have to worry about one Russian. I'm not worried about Ukrainian and Russians, okay? I've lived for 40-some years with a Norwegian, so it's easy. Shall we take a break now? Let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to understand these things in a way that we can know what the sign is that is about to take place on planet Earth, know our responsibility at that time, and know our responsibility before that time. It's clear that you are now bringing to perfection the message that you opened up in 1989 concerning the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. And it's clear that time is short and time is moving quickly. So we ask again that as we spend the time studying here this Sabbath day, that you would bless us with light that would edify each and every one of us in this room. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.